When I designed this vehicle to drive around Africa, I included dual batteries because I wanted to run a fridge, I wanted to run my water pump, my camp lights and charge my electronics, but I did not want to drain the starter battery, which would have left me stranded. The system in here worked pretty well, but there's no doubt it's getting old and tired now, and there's much better ways of doing things. Now we have lithium batteries that are half the weight, size, and double the capacity. We have integrated solar and DC to DC chargers. These things are way more efficient, and this is a much better way to do it. So on today's episode, let's rip out all the old junk, let's install the latest and greatest from Renogy, and breathe new life into the old girl. My name's Dan, this is The Road Chose Me. Let's get stuck straight into it. So a quick refresher of what we've got going on here. We've got two gel batteries mounted, double stacked. The top one is the starter for the car. The bottom one is the house battery. That house battery has been dead for about 2 years now. So actually, I haven't been able to use my fridge or my interior lights or my water pump. None of that works because the battery is dead. These things worked okay. I did kill more than a couple of them in Africa. They only have a 55 amp hour capacity, which given they're gel batteries, you can't even take that much out of them. You get maybe 60 or 70% of that, and then they're dead and you will permanently damage the battery. So it's time to get rid of these. I will keep one of them as the starter, but I'll get rid of the house battery, replace it with a modern lithium. Over here, we've got a big solenoid. This thing bridges the batteries together when the engine's running and gives me my dual battery setup and my isolation. It means the house battery charges by directly connecting it to the alternator. This has been done since 1960. This works, but it's not great. It's really inefficient. It's really hard on your alternator. It doesn't result in a well-charged battery. Worked fine for Africa, good enough, but there are much better ways now. So let's ditch that. Let's ditch the second battery and then see where we're at. Up here on the roof, we've got a couple of solid Renogy 100 watt solar panels. So 200 watts in total, and these things have been great. I installed them in Mali in West Africa in late 2019, and I see no reason to replace them. They're still performing great. We just need to change the battery and the controller, and then we'll be making tons of solar. So one job we don't have to do today. Here on the inside of the rear passenger door, we've got the old solar charge controller. So this thing I bought in 2015. This is a PWM solar controller, so old technology for sure. And the only thing it does is solar, nothing to do with DC to DC, can't charge off the alternator. So this thing is very much a dinosaur. It is time for it to go. We'll be ripping this out with today's job as well. Every time I have to get batteries in or out of this dual battery tray, I kind of curse it. It's really finicky and hard to get at the bolts, and there's a huge spaghetti of wiring because both batteries are so close together. That being said, it has proven itself time and again as strong enough. This was in the Jeep for all of Africa, including the rollover, including all the water crossings, all of that, and I've never had a single problem with it. So in terms of durability, the Odyssey dual battery tray, absolutely it has proven itself. This is a tough contender. This solenoid is from Painless Wiring, and the same story applies to it. It's certainly not the most efficient way of doing things, but it has proven itself plenty tough and durable over the years. So now we've got those batteries out of the engine bay, we can do a comparison here between the new lithium and the old AGM battery. And the first thing, you might have noticed how hard I struggled to get the second one out. This guy weighs 43 pounds versus the new lithium weighs only 27. So I think that is immediately the biggest difference. You can see the lithium is a little bit bigger in each dimension, maybe between half an inch and an inch. And then the other massive difference is that this old AGM battery is officially rated at 55 amp hours versus the new Renogy is 100 amp hours. But the huge caveat there is, as we saw in the last video, you can actually take 100 amp hours out of the lithium and it's fine. That's what it's designed for, and it really will give you that much energy. This being rated at 55 doesn't really make any sense. If you tried to take 55 amp hours out of this, you probably get about 60 or 70% of that, so maybe 40 amp hours. Then the battery is going to go below 10 volts and you will permanently damage that battery. It will never be the same again. So although it is rated at 55 amp hours, it's actually not even close to that. This is kind of how things were done in the olden days. That's why it's old. That's why I'm getting rid of it. The new lithium is definitely the way to go. Way more capacity, way lighter. This is a win all around. Disconnecting the wires to the old charge controller, I'm careful to tape up the red ends so they won't spark and so I know which is which. Now that I have everything out, it's also time to think about where I'm going to mount the Renogy charge controller. And so this is their latest DCDC and MPPT solar charge controller. This thing is IP67 rated. That means I could mount it under the hood if I want to. I can put it inside the cabin. Basically, this thing is weatherproofed, so you can mount it anywhere you want. That's a huge advantage to know that I could put it under the hood if I needed to. And I toyed with the idea above the starter battery, but because of the way my wiring is, because of where the solar panel wires are, all of that, I'm actually going to mount it in the back near where the old one used to be. But that's not to say that you couldn't mount it anywhere you want. And one of the features of this thing that is really incredible is that Renogy have listened to their customers and they've improved how their split chargers work. This is a 50 amp charger, and what it will do is it will use 25 amps from solar and it will use 25 amps from your alternator to charge your battery at a maximum of 50 amps. That's really good, but there was kind of a downside to that. Let's say it was a cloudy day like today, and let's say your solar is just making a little bit of power, but not very much. The way that this thing works is because it detects there's some solar input, it is dedicating 25 amps to that, even though let's say your solar is only putting out 1 or 2, and then it will only take 25 amps from the alternator. So at best, you're charging it, let's say 27 amps. Not ideal out of a 50 amp charge controller. So that's all changed on this model. There's now a setting in the DC Home app. You can decide at what level this will turn off the solar input. It's an amp setting from 1 amp all the way up to 10 amps. So on a cloudy day like this, I could set it and say 5 amps is my threshold. If the solar is putting out less than 5 amps, just turn it off, don't even use it. And at that point, it will say, oh, okay, no solar input. I'll take the whole 50 amps from the alternator, please. So even on a cloudy day, you'll still be getting full charge at 50 amps. Then let's say the sun comes out, your solar ticks over 5 amps, maybe it starts putting out 10 or 15, this will automatically say, okay, yeah, let's re-enable the solar input, let's start taking power from solar and from the alternator to combine together to get our 50 amps. So that's a really neat feature that the previous version that I had in Australia, it did not have that feature. Now the latest and greatest, it does. So they're always improving these things, which I think is really cool. And you can see too how small and light this is, much smaller than the one I had in Australia. And this charger too, it doesn't only work with lithium batteries. You can set the battery type right here with some buttons, or you can do it in the DC Home app. It accepts all the normal types of batteries, gel, AGM, old school lead acid, lithium, all of that, no problem. So I'm getting into it here, trying to remember all my wiring that I did all those years ago. And I'm in here under the seat. I just found a piece of broken glass. That is from the rollover in Uganda. I did the best I could at the time to clean it all up, but there are still bits of broken glass. No doubt some of this dirt under here is Africa. There's actually quite a bit of stuff under here that you could spend some time looking around. Hopefully there's no like little African critters running around, but I haven't seen any in a few years. So now that I've wrestled everything out, it's time to start thinking about where the new battery and the new charge controller will go. And when I designed and built this Jeep, this dual battery tray, it is designed to fit the Optima D34 yellow tops. It will not fit any other batteries. It fits 2 of them and it fits them just perfectly to the nearest, couple of millimeters. So there's no space here to put a battery that is not the identical same size, even right down to having the kind of curved 6 cells like that. That was a mistake I made when I designed this thing. Please learn from my mistake. When you design somewhere to carry your battery, make sure that it has some wiggle room so that it can fit batteries of different brands, different sizes. even just a couple of inches in every dimension, it'll make a big difference when you're somewhere else in the world. It was really hard for me to source these things. I had to buy some in South Africa, I had to buy some in Tanzania. They were really hard to get and they were hyper expensive, you know, because they're imported from the Western world. So with that said, my plan is I'm only going to have one battery here in the original holder. I'll have to modify its tie down strap so that it can just hold one of them. That'll be my starter battery. And then for the house battery, the new lithium, I'm gonna put it in the back. And climb on back with me, I'll show you what I'm thinking. There's some work to be done. At first I resisted taking off this piece of plywood. It hasn't been off since I built it originally, but I'm really glad I did. It gave great access. Here we are at the back of the Jeep, and I'll show you what I'm thinking. That is the fridge behind the front passenger seat, and I have this big space here. The old charge controller used to mount right here. These are the solar wires coming down. So I think this volume inside the cabinet is going to be the place for this battery and probably for the new charge controller as well. Not ideal to have them in a cabinet because it's taking up storage that could be other stuff, but you know, that's my mistake for building the dual battery holder under the hood that won't fit a different battery. So I've been playing around with orientations quite a bit. The battery, I think, fits pretty well right there. It won't fit if I rotate it 90 degrees, which is a bummer. It'd be good if it did. And then for the charge controller, there's a few different options here. I'm thinking hanging it up here off these aluminum bars. And I have a few different options here. I'd really like to pick up more than just the top mounting spots. I think it's important that it isn't going to flap around and it isn't going to kind of, you know, bounce or anything like that. I can also put it up nice and high so it's right underneath the wood that goes on top here. So I may move it over and put it here so that I can get a screw down in this vertical. And it's tempting to flip it upside down because most of my wiring goes to that side. And now out here, I get the status LEDs. So I'll actually be able to see what it's doing when I open this cabinet door. So that's what I'm up to. It's time to start mounting these things. One of the huge advantages of using aluminum tube like this to build your cabinets is you always have a frame to work with. You can drill holes in it, you can run bolts through it, mount stuff to it. Pretty handy actually. And in terms of wiring this charge controller, it's actually really simple. Each one of these wires is labeled and it's not complicated. It really is something you can do yourself. The easiest one to think about is the negative wire. It's the black one. It says negative right on it. The funny thing about these 12 volt setups, negative is just negative for everything. You connect this to the house, the lithium battery, you connect it to the negative of your starter battery and to the negative of the solar panels. Negative is just always negative across the entire system. So that one's really easy. The next one that I come across, it says out positive. So this is the output of this charger getting ready to charge your house battery. In my case, that's the new lithium. Whatever battery you have that is going to be running your fridge and all your accessories, this wire goes on the positive. Pretty straightforward. Next one is red wire. It says alternator plus. Makes sense. You connect this to the alternator on your vehicle. And the reality is the positive output of your alternator, it has a huge big red strap, a huge red wire that goes directly to the positive on your starter battery. So in reality, you can just connect this to the red of your starter battery. That's the same thing as connecting it to the red of the alternator. And don't worry about it. This guy does all the isolation. This is not going to result in draining your starter battery by connecting it to the starter. This is going to allow it to charge the house battery off the alternator. So it'll allow current to flow from the alternator down into the house battery. Pretty easy. And then the final one actually says PV positive. It's a yellow wire. I think it makes sense. PV is photovoltaic solar panel. And I've actually just grafted on an MC4 connector, kind of a standard solar panel connector, just so that I can connect it in really easily that way. It does have a temperature sensor wire. You don't need to use this when you're using a lithium battery, but I think with a lead acid, they recommend a temperature sensor just so that it can know what temperature the battery's at. And it also does actually have a couple of communication ports. If you're running a more complicated setup with multiple batteries and multiple meters and all that, you can plug in some extra communication things. I'm not going to use any of those. So for me, all I need to do now is connect up each of these wires. Pretty straightforward. So I've just wrapped up everything under the hood here, and now I can move backwards. So I've got one battery in here as the starter. I had to flip around the positive and the negative because now this battery's upside down. The Jeep wiring didn't love that, but I made it work. And what I've also done is I've run wires that are going to go back to the charge controller. So there's a wire here on the negative and one on the positive as well. And absolutely, the other end of this positive wire is currently taped up. I don't want it to touch anything, any part of the frame or anything, it'll spark. And there's an argument that you don't need to run a wire all the way up here for the negative. You could just connect the output, the negative on the charge controller, to the ground of the Jeep, some metal part. That would work okay, but I think this way you're gonna get much better performance, much better charging. And this is all so that it can come from the alternator back to charge the house battery that's in the back. And to use the right gauge wire, I always like to Google it and look up one of these charts. It tells you for the amount of current you want the wire to carry and the length of the wire you're gonna have, what gauge of wire you should use. So always double check that and make sure you use the recommended wire gauge, because you wanna make sure that you're not gonna overheat or overload the wire, which could start a fire. Also, definitely worth putting a fuse on this positive wire and put it as close to this battery as you can, so that if this wire did ground out anywhere along the way, maybe you screw into it or it just rubs through eventually, that way the fuse will protect you and you won't get a spark and you won't get a fire that way either. I always like to through bolt and put nylocks on the back, just to make sure things can't rattle loose. And in terms of holding the battery down, Renogy sell these sweet little feet that make it really straightforward. So there we go, all the wiring is finished and the system is complete. And so if we just refresh the DC Home app, we can see, well, the battery's at 0 because I depleted it in my last test, but we can see the charge controller is active, the battery is active, and the charge controller tells us that the house battery is at 12.9, it tells us the starter battery is at 12.2, and currently it's not seeing any solar. I'm parked in the shade and I probably should clean off those solar panels. So obviously solar would charge. Now let's have a look what happens when we start the Jeep. I'll do that now. So one of the great features is there's actually a little delay to let your engine warm a little before it puts load on the alternator. If I refresh the app now, still nothing, we're still waiting for that delay. I think it's either 30 seconds or a minute. I should read the manual. Refresh again, and there we go. First indication was that we're charging at 25 amps. And if we refresh again, there we go. So it's now pulling in 47 amps from the alternator and 49 amps are going into the battery. And I'm sure that'll change. It kind of fluctuates up and down as things change, but there you go. 49 amps are now going into the battery, which means smack on 2 hours to charge a 100 amp hour battery. That math works out. So just like that, we're now charging at 50 amps, which is an enormous amount of current going into that lithium battery. Of course, they're designed for it. It'll take that current no problem at all. And so just like that, now we have isolated lithium house battery with a really modern charge controller. It'll take charge from the solar panels. It'll take it from the alternator when the engine's running. Now I can run my fridge and all my accessories for the first time in a long time. So if you've got any questions or you'd like to learn more, there's a link down in the description to Renogy's site where you can buy this charge controller. You can buy that battery and there's a 5% off promo code on the battery if you want to see that. And if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to ask them down below in the comments. I'm always happy to help any way that I can. Let me know what system you've got, what works for you. I really love this setup. It has been flawless for me across 5 continents now and 200,000 miles or something. So I'll be doing this again in the new Jeep camper coming very shortly. So until next time, have fun out there and maybe I'll bump into you on the road. Pardon me while I burst into flames. I've had enough of the world and its people's mindless game. Pardon me. Pardon me. Don't ever be the same. Don't ever be the same. Yeah.